Section 4. Rowena nearly threw a fit when Mallory rode into the rec hall. "Oh, fair knight, ye be sorely wounded indeed," she cried, helping him down from his rohorse. "Certes, an ye bleed so much ye may die." Mallory's head was throbbing, and he saw two damsels that hight Rowena instead of only one. "I'll be all right after I lie down for a while," he said. "And don't worry about the bleeding. It's almost stopped." He took a step in the direction of his bedroom office, staggered and would have fallen if she hadn't caught his arm. Her strength astonished him. For all the lightness of his armor, it still lent him an overall weight of some 210 pounds, and yet the shoulder which she provided for him to lean on did not give once all the way to his bedside. She had his pauldrons, breastplate, and arm coverings off in no time flat. His cuisses, greaves, and sollerets followed. The last he remembered was lying there in his undergarments and his chain-mail vest with three faces swimming in the misted sea of his vision, each of them invested with the peculiar beauty that concern, and concern alone, can grant. "How is Mammakin's little man now?" the rent-a-mammakin asked, applying soothing sedasalve to the boy Mallory's swollen ear. "He hit me, Mammakin," the boy Mallory sobbed, "just because I wouldn't tell him that G stands for geography. I hate geography. I hate it, hate it, hate it. Nasty old rent-a-robogogue. Mammakin sent him away. He was an old model that got rented out by mistake. Is Mammakin's little man's ear all right now?" The boy Mallory sat up. "I want my real—" he began. The man Mallory sat up. "I want my real—" he began. "I have great joy of thy swift recovery, fair sir," Rowena said. She was perched on the edge of his bed, applying a cool and soothing ointment to his ear. On the table by the bed lay a basin of water, and on her lap lay a pink tube. He grabbed the tube, looked at the label. Sedasalve. He sighed with relief. "Where did you find it?" he asked. "La, fair sir, when ye did seem no longer on live, I did run both toward and forward in the castle seeking a magical salve whereby I might succour ye, whereupon I did come to a white box in the chapel, wherein lay many magical tubes of diverse colors and natures, whereof I did choose one, and—" Mallory was incredulous. "You chose a tube at random?" he demanded. "Good Lord, it might have contained a counter-agent that could have killed me." The letters thereon seemed of a magical nature, fair knight. And the color was seemly." "Well, anyway, it was the right one." He looked at her. Could she read, he wondered? He was tempted to ask her, but refrained for fear of embarrassing her. "In that same white box," he said, "you will find a big bottle filled with round red pellets. Would you get it for me?" When she returned with it, he took 2 of the pills, then he laid his head back on the pillow. "They'll restore the blood I lost," he explained. "But in order for them to do the job properly, I've got to lie perfectly still for at least 1 hour." She sat down on the edge of the bed. "Mary, the magic of Merlin is marvelous, albeit not as marvelous as the magic of Joseph of Arimathea." "What did he do that was so marvelous?" The plum-blue eyes were fixed full upon his face. "Ye wit not of the tale of the white shield ye bear, fair sir? List, and I will tell ye. It befell after the passion of our Lord 32 year, that Joseph of Arimathea, the gentle knight, the which took down our Lord off the holy cross, at that time departed from Jerusalem with a great party of his kindred with him. and so he labored till that they came to a city that hight Sarras. And at that time that Joseph came to Sarras, there was a king that hight Evelake, that had great war against the Saracens, and in especially against one Saracen, the which was King Evelake's cousin, a rich king and a mighty, which marched nigh this land, and his name was called Ptolemy Lafientes. So on a day these two met to do battle. Then Joseph, the son of Joseph of Arimathea, went to King Evelake, and told him he should be discomfit and slain, but if he left his belief of the old law, and believed upon the new law. And then there he showed him the right belief of the Holy Trinity, to the which he agreed unto with all his heart. And there this shield was made for King Evelake, in the name of him that died upon the cross. And then— "Hold it a minute," Mallory said. "This shield you finally got around to mentioning, is it the same one that you set out to tell me about?" "Wit ye well, fair sir. And then through King Evelake's good belief he had the better of King Ptolemy. For when Evelake was in the battle there was a cloth set afore the shield, and when he was in the greatest peril he left put away the cloth, and then his enemies saw a figure of a man on the cross, wherethrough they all were discomfit. And so it befell that a man of King Evelake's was smitten his hand off, and bare that hand in his other hand. And Joseph called that man unto him, and bade him go with good devotion touch the cross. And as soon as that man had touched the cross with his hand, it was as whole as ever it was tofore. Then soon after there fell a great marvel, that the cross of the shield at one time vanished away, that no man wist where it became. And then King Evelake was baptized, and for the most part all the people of that city. So soon after Joseph would depart, and King Evelake would go with him, whether he would or nold. And so by fortune they came into this land, that at the time was called Great Britain, and there they found a great felon Paynim, that put Joseph into prison. And so— "A great what?" Mallory asked. In one sense the story was familiar to him, but what bothered him was the fact that it was familiar in another sense, too, a sense he couldn't put his finger on. "A wicked unbeliever in our Lord. And so by fortune tidings came unto a worthy man that hight Mondramus, and he assembled all his people for the great renown he had heard of Joseph. And so he came into the land of Great Britain, and disinherited this felon Paynim, and consumed him, and therewith delivered Joseph out of prison. And after that all the people were turned to the Christian faith. Not long after that Joseph was laid in his deadly bed. And when King Evelake say that, he made much sorrow, and said, For thy love I have left my country, and sith ye shall depart out of this world, leave me some token of yours that I may think on you. Joseph said, That will I do full gladly. Now bring me your shield that I took you when ye went into battle against King Ptolemy. Then Joseph bled at the nose, so that he might not by no means be staunched. And thereupon that shield he made a cross of his own blood. Now may ye see a resemblance that I love you, for ye shall never see this shield, but ye shall think on me, and it shall be always as fresh as it is now. And never shall man bear this shield about his neck, but he shall repent it, unto the time that Galahad, the good knight, bare it, and the last of my lineage shall have it about his neck, that shall do many marvellous deeds. Now, said King Evelake, where shall I put this shield, that this worthy knight may have it? Ye shall leave it there as Nacien, the hermit, shall be put after his death. For thither shall that good knight come the 50th day after that he shall receive the order of knighthood, and so— When Mallory awoke, Rowena's head was resting on his chest, and she was breathing the soft and even breaths of untroubled sleep. Her hair, viewed thus closely, was not as dark as he had first believed it to be. It was brown, really, rather than dark brown, and astonishingly lustrous. Without thinking, he rested his hand lightly upon her head. She stirred then, and sat up, rubbing her plum-blue eyes. For a moment she stared at him uncomprehendingly. Then, "Prithee, forgive me, fair sir," she said. Mallory sat up too. "Forgive you for what?" "Go open a couple of vacuum tins while I get into my armor. I'm going to bring this caper to a close." Thy strength has returned?" "I never felt better in my life." In the rec hall he said, sitting down at the table before one of the two vacuum tins she had opened, "You never did ask me what happened." "Ye will tell me of thy own will, an ye wish me to know." Mallory took a mouthful of simul steak, chewed and swallowed. "Your Sir Launcelot turned out to be a phony, and pulled a rabbit out of his helmet, the nature of which I'd better not try to describe to you." Eyes round as plums, she regarded him across the table. A phony, fair sir?" Mallory nodded. "That's a sort of felon paynim who plays golp." "But with my own eyes I did see his armor, fair knight." "That's right, you saw his armor, but you didn't see him. A certain character by the name of Perfidion was residing behind that hardware, not the good Sir Launcelot." "Perfidion?" Mallory grinned. "Sir Jason Perfidion, a knight-errant ye wit not of. But the tournament's not over yet, and this time I've got the rabbit. He thinks I'm dead." He left ye for dead, fair sir?" "That he did, and if that little brain-buster of his had struck just 1 inch to the right, I'd have been just that." He shoved his empty vacuum tin away and stood up. "Excuse me a minute. I've got to visit the Sorcerer's Tower again." In the control room, he took the Yore back to 7:20 p.m. of the day and rematerialized it half a mile farther down the valley. Turning, he saw that Rowena had followed him and was watching him from the doorway. "Whereabouts may I find oats that I may feed thy horse, fair knight?" she asked. "Easy Money doesn't eat. He—" Mallory paused, astonished at 2 of the largest tears he had ever seen coalesced in her eyes and went tumbling down her cheeks. "Oh, it's not that he's sick," he rushed on. "It's just that horses like him don't require food to keep them going. Why, Easy Money's guaranteed for— he'll live another 30 years." The sun came up beyond the plum-blue horizons of her eyes. "It pleaseth me mickle to hear ye speak thus, fair knight. I have great joy of him." Back in the rec hall, Mallory pulled on his gauntlets, reset his timepiece, and donned his helmet. The left audio amplifier was shot, but otherwise the piece was in good condition, aside from the dent, of course. He encephalopathed Easy Money to his side, hung his shield around his neck, and mounted. "Hand me my spear, will you, Rowena?" he asked. She did so. "Ye be a most noble knight indeed, fair sir," she said, "for to set so little store by thine own life in the service of a damsel, the which is undeserving of thy deeds. I would lever that ye forsook the Sangreal than ye be fordone." Her concern touched him, and he removed his helmet and leaned down and kissed her on the forehead. "Keep the home fires burning," he said. Then, setting his helmet back in place, he activated the lock, rode across the mirage moat, and set forth into the forest once again. Section 5. This time, when he reached the crest of the ridge that separated the two valleys, Mallory took an azimuth on the towers of Carbonek, Encephalo fed the direction to Easy Money, and programmed the animal to proceed in as straight a course as possible. In the east, the moon was just beginning to rise. In the west, traces of the sunset lingered blood-red just above the horizon. On the highway below, a knight sitting astride a brown rohorse and bearing a white shield with a red cross in the center was riding toward Carbonek to challenge a 22nd century felon paynim in imitation Age of Chivalry armor. In the valley Mallory had just left behind him there were 2 castles named Yor, and soon a third would pop into existence, and yet another Mallory come riding out. Mallory grinned. It was a little bit like playing chess. The forest which Easy Money presently entered was park-like in places, and sometimes the trees thinned out into wide, moonlit meadows. Crossing one of the meadows, Mallory saw the first star, and when at length Easy Money emerged on the highway, the heavens were decked out in typical midsummer panoply. The rohorse had followed its programming almost perfectly, and had emerged at a point just south of the lane leading to the castle of Carbonek. All Mallory had to do was to encephalo-guide it farther down the highway to a point beyond the site of the forthcoming joust. While doing so, he kept well within the concealing shadows of the bordering oaks and beeches, where the ground was soft and could give forth no telltale clip-clop of hoof-beats. His circumspection proved wise, as in one sense, of course, it already had, and when the false Sir Launcelot came riding by on his way to the castle and the chamber of the Sangreal, he was no more aware of Mallory III's presence by the roadside than he would presently be aware of Mallory II's presence in the shadows of the trees that bordered the lane. Mallory III grinned again and brought Easy Money to a halt just beyond the next bend. "Wit ye well, Sir Jason, that thy hours be numbered," he said. He remained seated in the saddle, feeling pretty good about the world. In no time at all, if his one-man ambuscade came off, he would be on his way back to the Yor, and thence to the 22nd century and a haircut. Selling the Sangreal without the aid of a professional time fence like Perfidion would be difficult, of course, but it could be done, and once it was done, he, Mallory, could take his place on Get-Rich-Quick Street with the best of them, and no questions would be asked. There was, to be sure, the problem of what to do about a certain damsel that hight Rowena, but he would face that when he came to it. Maybe he could drop her off a dozen years in the future in a region far enough removed from Carbonek to ensure her safety. He would see. At this point in his reflections, he was jolted into alertness by the sound of approaching hoofbeats. A moment later he heard a second set of hoofbeats and knew that Mallory II had made his presence known. Presently both sets crescendoed into staccato thunder as the 2 knights came pounding toward each other, and not long afterward there was a clank and a clatter as Mallory II went tumbling out of his saddle and into the roadside weeds. Finally the single set of hoofbeats took over again, and Mallory III saw a horse and rider coming around the bend in the highway. He braced himself. Before making his play, he waited till horse and rider were directly opposite him. Then he encephalopathed Easy Money to charge. Sir Launcelot managed to get his shield up in time, but the maneuver did him no good. Mallory's spearhead struck the shield dead center, and Sir Launcelot went sailing out of his saddle to land with an awesome clatter flat on his back on the highway. he did not get up. Dismounting, Mallory removed the man's helmet. It was Perfidion, all right. There was a large bruise on the side of his head, and he was out cold, but he was still breathing. Next, Mallory looked for the Sangreal. Perfidion had concealed it somewhere, and apparently he had done the job well. Since the armor could not have accommodated an object of that size, the hiding place had to be somewhere on the body of his horse. The horse was standing quietly beside Easy Money in the middle of the highway. It was jet black, and its fetlock-length trappings were blue, threaded with silver. Otherwise, the two steeds were identical. Mallory tumbled to the truth then, went over to where the black horse was standing, raised its trappings, found the tiny activator button, and depressed it. The croup hood rose up, and there in the secret compartment, wrapped in red samite, lay the cause of the mounting absentee rate in King Arthur's court. Always the skeptic, Mallory raised a corner of the samite in order to make certain that he was not being cheated. Instantly a reflected ray of moonlight stabbed upward into his eyes, and for a moment he was blinded. Exorcising the thought that sneaked into his mind, he closed the croup hood, rearranged the trappings, and returned to Perfidion's side. Dragging the armor-encumbered man over to the black rohorse and slinging him over the saddle was no easy matter, but Mallory managed. Then he picked up Perfidion's helmet and spear and set the former on the pommel and wedged the latter in one of the stirrups. Finally he mounted Easy Money, and, encephalopathing the black rohorse to follow, set out down the highway away from the castle of Carbonek. Make-believe castles could fool the hadbeens, but they couldn't fool a professional. He spotted the phony towers of Perfidion's TSB rising above the trees before he had proceeded half a mile. After raising the portcullis, he got the man down from the black rohorse, dragged him inside, and propped him against the rec-hall bar. Then he got the man's helmet and spear and laid them beside him. After considerable reflection, he went into the control room, set the time dial for June 10th, 1964, the space dial for a busy intersection in downtown Los Angeles, and punched out "hot dog stand" on the lumillusion panel. Satisfied, he went into the generator room and short-circuited the automatic throw-out unit so that when rematerialization took place, the generator would burn up. Finding a ball of heavy-duty twine, he returned to the control room, tied one end to the master switch, and began backing out of the TSB, unwinding the twine as he went. In the rec hall he paused and grinned down at the still unconscious Perfidion. "It's a better break than you meant to give me, Jason," he said. "And don't worry. Once you explain to the authorities what you're doing in a suit of 6th century armor, and how you happened to open a giant hot dog stand in the middle of a traffic-clogged crossroads, you'll be all right. As a matter of fact, with your knowledge of things to come, you'll probably wind up a richer man than you are now, if the smog doesn't get you first." He stepped through the lock, jerked the twine, and the castle vanished into thin air. Remounting Easy Money, and encephalopathing the black rohorse to follow, he started back toward the Yore, taking a direct route through the forest. He was halfway to his destination and had just emerged into a wide meadow when he saw the knight with the white shield riding toward him in the bright moonlight. In the center of the shield there was a vivid blood-red cross. When the knight saw Mallory, he brought his steed to a halt. Moonlight glimmered eerily on his shield, turned his helmet to silver. His armor seemed to emit an unearthly light, a light that was at once terrifying and transcendent. The hilt of his sword was as blood-red as the cross on his shield. So was the pommel of his spear. Here was righteousness incarnate. Here, in the form of an armored man on horseback, was the quintessence of the age of chivalry. Not the age of chivalry as exemplified by the vain and boasting nobles who had constituted 9/10 of the knight-errantry profession, and who had used the quest of the Holy Grail as an excuse to seek after mead and maidens, but the age of chivalry as it might have been if the ideal behind it had been shared by the many instead of by the few. The age of chivalry, in short, as it had come down to posterity through the pages of Malory's Le Morte d'Arthur. At length the knight spoke. "I hight Sir Galahad of the Table Round." Reluctantly, Mallory encephalopathed his 2 rohorses to halt, and said the only thing he had left to say. "I hight Sir Thomas of the Castle Yor." "By whose leave bear ye likenesses of the red arms and the white shield whereon shines the red cross, the which was put there by Joseph of Arimathea, whilst he lay dying in his deadly bed?" Mallory did not answer. There was silence. Then, "I would joust with ye," Sir Galahad said. There it was, laid right on the line. The challenge. The death sentence. "Nonsense," Mallory told himself. "He's nothing but a 19-year-old kid. With your rohorse and your superior weapons, you can unseat him in 2 seconds flat. And once he's down, that glorified junk pile he's wearing will glue him to the ground so fast he won't be able to lift a finger." Aloud he said, "Have at me, then!" Instantly Sir Galahad wheeled his horse around and rode to the far side of the meadow. There he wheeled the horse around again and dressed his spear. Moonlight danced a silvery saraband on his white shield, and the blood-red cross blurred and seemed to run. Mallory dressed his own spear. Immediately Sir Galahad charged. "Full speed ahead, Easy Money," Mallory encephalopathed, and the rohorse took off like a rocket. All he had to do was to hang on tight, and the joust would be in the bag, he reassured himself. Sir Galahad's spear would break like a matchstick, while his own superior spear would penetrate Sir Galahad's shield as though the shield was made of tissue paper, as, in a sense, it really was, when you compared the metal that constituted it to modern alloys. No matter how you looked at the situation, the kid was in for a big letdown. Mallory almost felt sorry for him. The hoofbeats of horse and rohorse crescendoed. There was the resounding clang of steel coming into violent contact with steel. Mallory's spear struck Sir Galahad's shield dead center and snapped in 2. Sir Galahad's spear struck Mallory's shield dead center, and Mallory sailed over Easy Money's croup and crashed to the ground. He was stunned, both mentally and physically. Staggering to his feet, he drew his sword and raised his shield. Sir Galahad had wheeled his horse around, and now he came riding back. Several yards from Mallory, he tossed his spear aside, dismounted as lightly as though he wore no armor at all, drew his sword, and advanced. Mallory stepped forward, his confidence returning. His spear had been defective, that was it. But his sword and his shield weren't, and now that the kid had elected to give him a sporting chance, he would teach the young upstart a lesson that he would never forget. Again the 2 men came together. Down came Sir Galahad's 6th-century sword, Up went Mallory's 22nd century shield. There was an ear-piercing clang, and the shield parted down the middle. Aghast, Mallory stepped back. Sir Galahad moved in, sword upraised again. Mallory raised his own sword, caught the full force of the terrific downrushing blow on the blade. His sword was cut cleanly in two, his left pauldron was cleanly cleaved, and a great numbness afflicted his left shoulder. He went down. He stayed down. Sir Galahad leaned over him, unbroken sword uplifted. The cross in the center of the snow-white shield was a bright and burning red. "Ye must yield you as an overcome man, or else I may slay you." "I yield," Mallory said. Sir Galahad sheathed his sword. "Ye be not sorely wounded, and sithen I desire not neither of they two steeds, as belike they be as unworthy as they pieces, ye can return to thy castle unholpen." Mallory blacked out for a moment, and when he came to, the shining knight was gone. He lay there in the moonlight for some time, looking up at the stars. At length he fought his way to his feet and encephalopathed the two rohorses to his side. Mounting Easy Money, he encephalopathed it to return to the westernmost castle of yore, and encephalopathed the other rohorse to follow. He left his broken weapons where they lay. What had gone out of the world during the last 1,600 years that had left sophisticated 22nd century steel inferior in quality to naive 6th century wrought iron? What did Sir Galahad have that he, Mallory, lacked? Mallory shook his head. He did not know. The moonlit towers of the yore had become visible through the trees before it occurred to him that, before riding away, the man just might have removed the Sangreal from the black rohorse's croup. At first thought, such a possibility was too absurd to be entertained, but not on second thought. According to Le Morte d'Arthur, the fellowship of Sir Galahad, Sir Percival, and Sir Bors had taken both the table of silver and the Sangreal to Sarras, where, some time later, the Sangreal had been borne up to heaven, never to be seen again. Whether they had taken the table of silver did not concern Mallory, but what did concern him was the fact that if they had taken the Sangreal, they could have done so only if it had fallen into Sir Galahad's hands this very night. Tomorrow would be too late. Now was too late, in fact, provided, of course, that Mallory was destined to return with it to the 22nd century. Here, then, was the crossroads, the real moment of truth. Was he destined to succeed, or wasn't he? Hurriedly, he encephalopathed the two rohorses to halt, dismounted, and raised the black rohorse's trappings. He was dizzy from the loss of blood, but he did not let his dizziness dissuade him from his purpose, and he had the croup hood raised in a matter of a few seconds. He held his breath when he looked within, expelled it with relief. The Sangreal had not been disturbed. He lifted it out of the croup compartment, straightened its red samite covering, and cradled it in his arms. Too weak to remount Easy Money, he encephalopathed the two rohorses to follow and began walking toward the yore. Rowena must have seen him coming on one of the telewindows, for she had the lock open when he arrived. Her face went white when she looked at him, and when she saw the Grail, her eyes grew even larger than plums. He went over and set it gently down on the rec-hall table, then he collapsed into a nearby chair. He had just enough presence of mind left to send her for the bottle of blood restorer pills, and just enough strength left to swallow several of them when she brought it. Then he boarded the phantom ship that had mysteriously appeared beside him and set sail upon the soundless sea of night. Section 6. "No," said the rent-a-mammakin. "You cannot see her. She is displeased with your score in the get-rich-quick race." "I did my best," the boy Mallory sobbed. "But when it came to stepping on all those faces, I just couldn't do it." The rent-a-mammakin arranged its features into a severe frown, and strengthened its grip on the boy Mallory's arm. "You knew that they were only painted on the game floor to symbolize the competitive spirit," it said. "Why couldn't you step on them?" The boy Mallory made a final desperate effort to gain the bedroom door which his mother had just slammed, and before which the rent-a-mammakin stood. Then he sank defeated to the floor. "I don't know why. I just couldn't, that's all," he sobbed. He raised his voice. "But I will step on them. I'll step on real faces, too. Just you wait and see. I'll be a bigger get-rich-quick man than my father ever dreamed of being. I'll show her." "I'll show her," the man Mallory murmured. "Just you wait and see." He opened his eyes. Save for himself, the bedroom office was empty. "Rowena?" No answer. He raised his voice. "Rowena!" Again no answer. He frowned. The door to the bedroom office was open, and the castle certainly wasn't so large that his voice couldn't carry from one end of it to the other. His shoulder throbbed faintly, but otherwise he was unaware of his wound. Rowena had bound it neatly. It was said that Age of Chivalry gentlewomen were quite proficient in such matters, and apparently she had once again got hold of the right counteragent. He sat up and swung his feet to the floor. So far, so good. Tentatively he stood up. A wave of vertigo broke over him. As it passed, he was as good as new. The blood restorer pills had done their work well. Nevertheless, everything was not as it should be. Something was very definitely wrong. "Rowena!" he called again. Still no answer. She had removed his armor and piled it neatly at the foot of the bed. He stared at the various pieces, trying desperately to think. Something had awakened him, that was it. The slamming of a door, or a lock. He took a deep breath. He smelled green things, dampness, a forest at eventide. He knew then what was wrong. The lock of the Yore had been opened, and had been left open long enough for the evening air to permeate the interior of the TSB. Long enough, in other words, to have permitted someone to ride across the imaginary drawbridge that spanned the mirage moat. Afterward, the lock had slammed back into place of its own accord. He hurried into the rec hall. Easy Money stood all alone behind the tourist bar. The black rohorse was gone. His eyes leaped to the rec hall table. The Sangreal was gone, too. He groaned. The little idiot was taking it back. And after he had forbidden her to leave the castle, too. Well, no, he hadn't forbidden her exactly. He had forbidden her to leave it during his absence. He walked over to the telewindow nearest the lock and scrutinized the screen. She was nowhere in sight, but night was on hand, and the range of his vision, while considerably abetted by the light of the rising moon, was limited to the nearer trees. Presently he frowned. Was it still the same night, or had he been unconscious for almost 24 hours? It couldn't be the same night. The position of the moon disproved that. And yet he could swear that he had been unconscious for no more than a few hours. Belatedly he remembered his gauntlet timepiece and returned to the bedroom office. The timepiece registered 10:32. But that didn't make any sense either. The moon was still low in the sky. He knew then that there could be but one answer, and he headed for the control room post-haste. Sure enough, the jump board time dial had been set for 8:00 p.m. of the same day. He looked at the space dial. That had been set to rematerialize the Yore 1/2 mile farther west. He wiped his forehead. Good Lord, she might have sent the TSB all the way back to the age of reptiles. Even worse, she might have plunked it right down in the middle of World War III. She hadn't, though. In point of fact, she had done exactly what she had set out to do, taken the Yore back to a point in time from which the Sangreal could be returned to the castle of Carbonek less than an hour after it had been stolen. Suddenly he remembered how she had watched him from the doorway of the control room each time he had reset the time and space dials. Technologically speaking, she was little more than a child, but jump boards were as uncomplicated as modern technology could make them, and a person needed to be but little more than a child to operate them. Grimly, Mallory returned to his bedroom office and got into his armor. Then, ignoring the throbbing of his reawakened wound, he mounted Easy Money and set out. He had no weapons, but it could not be helped. With a little luck, he would have need of none. He was about due for a little luck, if you asked him. He gambled that Rowena would use the same route back to the chamber of the Sangreal that they had used in leaving it. Actually, she had no other choice, and he encephalo-guided Easy Money at a fast trot in the direction of the river, in the hope of overtaking her before she reached the entrance to the subterranean passage. However, the hope did not materialize, and he saw no sign of her till he reached the entrance himself. Strictly speaking, he saw no sign of her then either, but he did discern several dislodged stones that could have been thrown up by the black rohorse's hoofs. Entering the passage, he frowned. Until that moment, the incongruity of a 6th-century damsel encephalo-guiding a 22nd century rohorse had not struck him. After a moment, though, he had to admit that the incongruity was not as glaring as it had at first seemed. Encephalopathing was merely a glorified term for thinking, and Rowena, shortly after mounting Perfidion's steed, must have made the discovery that she had only to think where she wanted to go, in order for the rohorse to take her there. He had not remembered to bring a light, nor did he need one. The infrared rays of Easy Money's eye units were more than sufficient for the task on hand, and overtaking the girl would have been as easy as rolling off a log, if she hadn't been riding a rohorse too. Overtaking her wasn't of paramount importance anyway. He could confiscate the Sangreal after she returned it just as easily as he could before. The odd part about the whole thing was that Mallory never once thought of the inevitable overlap till he saw the flicker of torchlight up ahead. An instant later he heard the sound of a woman's voice, and instinctively he encephalo-guided Easy Money into a nearby shallow cave. The flickering light grew gradually brighter, and presently hoofbeats became audible. The woman's voice was loud and clear now, and Mallory made out her words above the purling of the underground stream. "And when he set down the maiden, and was armed at all pieces, save he lacked his spear. Then he dressed his shield, and drew out his sword, and Bors smote him so hard that it went through his shield and habergeon on the left shoulder. And through great strength he beat him down to the earth, and at the pulling of Bors' spear there he swooned. Then came Bors to the maid, and said, How seemeth it to you of this night ye be delivered at this time? Now, sir, said she, I pray you lead me there as this knight had me. So shall I do gladly. And took the horse of the wounded knight, and set the gentlewoman upon him, and so brought her as she desired. Sir Knight, said she, ye have better sped than ye weened, for an I had lost my maidenhead, 500 men should have died for it. What knight was he that had you in the forest? By my faith, said she, he is my cousin. So wot I never with what engine the fiend enchafed him, for yesterday he took me from my father privily. For I nor none of my father's men mistrusted him not, and if he had had my maidenhead, he should have died for the sin, and his body shamed and dishonored for ever. Thus as—" At this point the truth behind the sense of déjà vu that Mallory had experienced the first time he had heard the tale hit him so hard between the eyes that he jerked back his head. When he did so, his helmet came into contact with the cave wall and scraped against the stone. The rohorse and its 2 riders were directly across the stream now. "Shh!" Mallory the First whispered. Rowena the First gasped. "It were best that I thanked ye now for thy great kindness, fair knight," she said, "for anon we be no longer on live." "Nonsense," Mallory the First said. "If this fiend of yours is anywhere in the vicinity, he's probably more afraid of us than we are of him." Peradventure he hath already had meat," Rowena the First said hopefully. "The tale saith that on the fiend be filled he becomes aweary, and besets not them the which do pass him by in peace." "I'll keep my sword handy just in case he changes his mind," Mallory the First said. "Meanwhile, get on with your autobiography. Only for Pete's sake, cut it short, will you?" "An it please, fair sir. Thus as the fair gentlewoman stood talking with Sir Bors, there came 12 knights seeking after her, and anon—" For a long while after the voices fade away, Mallory the Fourth could not move. Hearing the story the second time, and, more important, hearing it from the standpoint of an observer, he had been able to identify it for what it really was. An excerpt from Le Morte d'Arthur. The Joseph of Arimathea bit had been an excerpt too, he realized now, probably lifted word for word from the text. It was odd indeed that a 6th-century damsel, who presumably couldn't read, could be on such familiar terms with a book that would not be published for another 943 years. But not so odd if she was a 22nd-century blonde in a 6th-century damsel's clothing. Remembering Perfidion's secretary, Mallory felt sick. No, there was no noticeable resemblance between her and the damsel that hight Rowena, but the removal of a girdle and 1/4 pound of make-up, not to mention the application of a luster-rich brown hair dye, and the insertion of a pair of plum-blue contact lenses, could very well have brought such a resemblance into being, and quite obviously had. The past police were noted for their impersonations, and most of them had eidetic memories. "Come on, Easy Money," Mallory encephalopathed. "You and I have got a little score to settle." When he entered the chamber of the Sangreal, Rowena the Fourth was arranging the red samite cover around the Grail. She jumped when she saw him. "Marry, fair sir, ye did startle me. Methinketh ye be asleep in thy castle." "Knock it off," Mallory said. "The masquerade's over." She regarded him with round, uncomprehending eyes. He got the impression that she had been crying. The masquerade, fair knight?" "That's right, the masquerade. You're no more the damsel Rowena than I'm the knight Sir Galahad." She lowered her eyes to his breastplate. I wot well ye be not Sir Galahad, fair sir. It happened that aforetime I did see Sir Galahad with my own eyes, and when ye did unlace thy unberere, and I did see thy face, I knew ye could not be him of which ye spake." Abruptly she raised her head and looked at him defiantly. "But I knew from thy eyes that ye be most noble, fair sir, and therefore, an ye did pretend to be him the which ye were not, ye did so for noble cause, and it were not for me to question." "I said knock it off," Mallory said, but with considerable less conviction. "I'm on to you, don't you see? You're a time fink." A time fink? I wot not what—" "An agent of the past police. One of those do-gooders who run around history replacing stolen goods and turning in hard-working people like myself. You gave yourself away when you lifted that Sir Bors bit straight out of Le Morte d'Arthur, and—" "But I did say ye sooth, fair sir. Sir Bors did verily succour my maidenhead. I wot not how there can be two of ye and two of me, and four hackneys when afore there were but two, and I wot not how by touching the magic board in thy castle in a certain fashion that I could make the hour earlier, and I wot not how the magic steed I did bestride brought me hither. I wot not none of these matters, fair sir. I wot only that the magic of thy castle is marvelous indeed." For a while Mallory didn't say anything. He couldn't. In the plum-blue eyes fixed full upon his face, truth shone, and that same truth had invested her every word. The damsel Rowena, despite all evidence to the contrary, and despite the glaring paradox the admission gave rise to, was not a phony, never had been a phony, and never would be a phony. She was, as a matter of fact, with the exception of Sir Galahad, the only completely honest person he had known in all his life. "Tell me," he said at length, "weren't you afraid to come back through that passage alone? Weren't you afraid the fiend would get you?" "La, fair sir, I had great fear. But it were not fitting that I bethought me of myself at such a time." She paused. Then, "What might be thy true name, Sir Knight?" "Mallory," Mallory said. "Thomas Mallory." "I have great joy of thy acquaintance, Sir Thomas." Mallory only half heard her. He was looking at the samite-covered Sangreal. No more obstacles stood between him and his quest, and time was a-wasting. He started to take a step in the direction of the silver table. His foot did not leave the floor. He was acutely aware of Rowena's eyes. As a matter of fact, he could almost feel them upon his face. It wasn't that they were any different than they had been before. It was just that he was suddenly and painfully cognizant of the trust and the admiration that shone in them. Despite himself, he had the feeling that he was standing in bright and blinding sunlight. Again he started to take a step in the direction of the silver table. Again his foot did not leave the floor. It wasn't so much the fact that she didn't believe he would take the Sangreal that bothered him. It was the fact that she couldn't conceive of him taking it. She could be convinced that black was white, perhaps, and that white was black, and that fiends hung out in empty caves and castles, but she could never be convinced that a knight of the qualities she imputed to Mallory could perform a dishonorable act. And there it was, laid right on the line. For all the good the Grail was going to do Mallory, it might just as well have been at the bottom of the Mindanao Deep. He sighed. His gamble hadn't paid off any more than Perfidion's had. The real Sir Galahad was the one who had inherited the Grail after all, not the false one. The false one grinned ruefully. "Well," he told the damsel Rowena, "it's been nice knowing you." He swallowed. For some reason his throat felt tight. I imagine you'll be all right now." To his amazement, she broke into tears. "Oh, Sir Thomas," she cried, "in my great haste to return the Sangreal to the chamber, and to right the grievous wrong committed by the untrue knight Sir Jason, I did bewray my trust again. For when I espied ye and me and Easy Money in the passage, I did suffer a great discomfort, and it so happed that when my steed did enter into a cave, that the Sangreal came free from my hands, and Mallory was staring at her. "You dropped it?" Stepping over to the silver table, she lifted a corner of the red samite. The dent was not a deep one, but just the same you didn't have to look twice to see it. I nist not what to do," she said. Suddenly Mallory remembered the first sound he had heard in the passage when he and Rowena were leaving the castle of Carbonek. "Well, how do you like that?" he said. He grinned. "I take it that this puts your hands in jeopardy all over again, right?" "Yea, Sir Thomas, but I would liever die than beseech thee again to—" "Which," Mallory continued happily, "makes it out of the question for a knight such as myself to leave you behind." He took her arm. "Come on," he said. "I don't know how I'm going to fit a 6th-century damsel into a 22nd century society, but believe me, I'm going to try." And will ye take Easy Money to this land whereof ye speak, Sir Thomas?" Sir Thomas grinned. "Wit ye well," he said, "and his buddy too. Come on." In the yore he tossed his helmet and gauntlets into a corner of the rec hall, and proceeded straight to the control room. There, with Rowena standing at his elbow, he set the time dial for June 21st, 2178, and the space dial for the Kansas City time tourist port. Lord, it would be good to get home again and get a haircut. "Here goes," he told Rowena, and threw the switch. There was a faint tremor. "Brace yourself, Rowena," he said, and took her over to the control room telewindow. Together they gazed upon the screen. Mallory gasped. The vista of spiral suburban dwellings which he had been expecting was not in the offing. In its stead was a green, tree-stippled countryside. In the distance a castle was clearly discernible. He stared at it. It wasn't a 6th-century job like Carbonek. It was much more modern. But it was still a castle. Obviously the jump board had malfunctioned and thrown the yore only a little ways into the future, the while leaving it in pretty much the same locale. He returned to the jump board to find out. Just as he reached it, its lights flickered and went out. The time and space dials, however, remained illumined long enough for him to see when and where the TSB had rematerialized. The year was 1428 A.D. The locale, Warwickshire. Mallory made tracks for the generator room. The generator was smoking, and the room reeked with the stench of shorted wires. He swore. Perfidion! So that was why the man had broken with tradition and invited a common time thief to a game of golp. If he had been anyone but Perfidion, he would have gimmicked the controls of the yore so that Mallory would have wound up directly in the 15th century sans sojourn in the 6th. But being Perfidion, he had wanted Mallory to know how completely he was being outsmarted. The chances were, though, that if the man had anticipated the near coincidence of the two visits to the chamber of the Sangreal, he would have seen to it that Mallory had never gotten a chance to use his Sir Galahad suit. Returning to the control room, Mallory saw that the lumillusion panel had been pre-programmed to materialize the yore as a 15th century English castle. Apparently it had been in the books all along for him to become a 15th-century knight, just as it had been in the books all along for Perfidion to become the proprietor of a misplaced hot-dog stand. Mallory laughed. He had gotten the best of the bargain after all. At least there was no smog in the 15th century. Who was he supposed to be, he wondered? Had his name gone down in history by any chance? Abruptly he gasped. Was he the Sir Thomas Mallory with estates in Northamptonshire and Warwickshire? Was he the Sir Thomas Mallory who had compiled and translated and written Le Morte d'Arthur? Almost nothing about the man's life was known, and probably the little that was known had been assumed. He could have popped up from nowhere, made his fortune through foreknowledge, and been knighted. He could have been a reformed time thief, stranded in the 15th century. But if he, Mallory, was Mallory, how in the world was he going to get 500 chapters of semi-historical data together and pass them off as Le Morte d'Arthur? Suddenly he understood everything. Going over to where Rowena was still standing in front of the telewindow, he said, "I'll bet you know no end of stories about the doings of the knights of the Table Round." "La, Sir Thomas! Ever I saw day of my life I have heard naught else in the court of my father." "Tell me," Mallory said, "how did this Round Table business begin? Or, better yet, how did the Grail business begin? We can take up the Round Table business later on." She thought for a moment. Then, "List, fair sir, and I will say ye. At the vigil of Pentecost, when all the fellowship of the Round Table were come into Camelot, and there heard their service, and the tables were set ready to the meat, right so entered into the hall a full fair gentlewoman on horseback that had ridden full fast, for her horse was all besweated. Then she there alit, and came before the king and saluted him, and he said, 'Damsel, God thee bless.' 'Sir,' said she, 'for God's sake say me where Sir Launcelot is.' 'Yonder ye may see him,' said the king. Then she went unto Launcelot and said, 'Sir Launcelot, I salute you on King Pelles' behalf, and I require you to come on with me hereby into a forest.' Then Sir Launcelot asked her with whom she dwelled. 'I dwell,' said she, 'with King Pelles.' 'What will ye with me?' said Launcelot. 'Ye shall know,' said she, 'when ye—'" "That'll do for now," Mallory interrupted. "We'll come back to it as soon as I get stocked up on paper and ink. Scheherazade," he added. "Scheherazade, Sir Thomas? I wot not—" He leaned down and kissed her. "There's no need for you to wot," he said. Probably, he reflected, he would have to do a certain amount of research in order to record the happenings that had ensued his and Rowena's departure, and undoubtedly said research would result ironically in the recording of the true visits of Sirs Galahad and Launcelot to the chamber of the Sangreal, the time slots on which he and Perfidion had gambled and lost their shirts. The main body of the work, however, had been deposited virtually on his lap, and its style and flavor had been arbitrarily determined. Moreover, contrary to what history would later maintain, the job would not be done in prison, but right here in the Castle of Yore, with Rowena sitting and dictating beside him. As for the impossibility of giving a 6th-century damsel as his major source, that could be avoided, as in one sense it already had been, by making frequent allusions to imaginary French sources. And as for the main obstacle to the endeavor, his 22nd-century cynicism, that had been obviated during his encounter with Sir Galahad. The book wouldn't be published till 1485, but just the same, he was keen to get started on it. Writing it should be fun. Which reminded him. "I know we haven't known each other very long, in one sense, Rowena," he said. "But in another, we've known each other for almost 900 years. Will you marry me?" She blinked once. Then her plum-blue eyes showed how truly blue they could become, and she threw her arms around his gorget. "Wit ye well, Sir Thomas," said she, "that there is nothing in the world but I would lever do than be thy bride." Thus did the prose epic known successfully as La Morte d'Arthur, the most ancient and famous history of the renowned Prince Arthur, King of Britain, as also all the noble acts and heroic deeds of his valiant knights of the Round Table, and La Morte d'Arthur come to be recorded. End of section 6. Recording by Roger Moline. End of A Knight There Was by Robert F. Young.